Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for your patience. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Despite the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, I hope you are all keeping well. The Bar Association of Sri Lanka warmly welcomes you to this international webinar organized by the Overseas Relations Committee of the Bar Association of Sri Lanka in collaboration with the Bar Council of the Maldives, titled The Express Pearl Disaster and the Legal Remedies for Managing Environmental Harm. This webinar was organized with the aim of highlighting the disaster that took place off the shores of our island nation and to address some of the challenges that we have faced ahead of us. My name is Vihara Herat, and I will be moderating today's event along with my co-moderators, Azeen Abdullah, Chanela Fonseca, and Nuzri Hussain. We are extremely delighted to have four esteemed and renowned international speakers to give us their insight on this topic. We have with us Professor Charita Patiarachi, Dr. Lalanath De Silva, Mr. Jainil Bandari, and Mr. Chantaka Jayasundara, President's Council. Due to unfortunate circumstances, Dr. Ruwantisa Aberatna is unable to join us, but we are hoping to have Dr. Aberatna at the follow-up webinar. If you have any questions, you will have the opportunity to type in, and these will be addressed during the question and answer session during the latter half of today's webinar. By the end of our time today, we hope to have raised international awareness on marine environment pollution and the remedies that are available to nations and regions in order to deal with and prevent such disasters. I might as well add that despite this webinar being organized on such short notice, we are very proud to have over 300 registrations. This webinar is a collaboration between the Bar Association of Sri Lanka and the Bar Council of the Maldives. I now call upon Mr. Salia Peiris, President's Council, the incumbent President of the Bar Association of Sri Lanka, followed by Mr. Maumoon Hamid, Senior Counsel, the President of the inaugural Bar Council of the Maldives, to deliver this welcome address. Mr. Salia Peiris will be addressing you first.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you to the webinar, and I must thank the Overseas Relations Committee of the Bar Association of Sri Lanka for organizing this webinar, and of course, to our distinguished panelists who are present today. As you're all aware, the Express Pearl disaster has brought into view many issues pertaining to multidisciplinary fields, so such as the environment, shipping, fundamental rights, all those are coming in to this to address the disaster. Now, one thing which the Bar Association wishes to do is to enhance the knowledge of its members, but also we would like to take to participate in international fora, and we need the support of those who are experts in this field. So this is the first of the measures of the Bar Association which we'll be willing to take in this respect, and we wish to assist the government of Sri Lanka, but very especially the Bar Association would like to look at the rights of the people who are affected as a result of this disaster. I think even now, the magnitude of the disaster is not known, and it might be in the months or years to come that we would really know. But we should also, I think, look at the future to see how the impact of this disaster could be mitigated, but also how we could prevent such disasters in the future. So I must thank the Bar Council of the Maldives, Mr. Maumoon Hamid, the president, the inaugural president of the Bar Council of the Maldives, for joining us today. And this is a joint initiative of our Overseas Relations Committee and the Bar Association of Sri Lanka and the Bar Association of the Maldives. So we thank you all for your participation. We hope that there would be a fruitful discussion on the issues at hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I now call upon Mr. Maumoon Hamid, Senior Counsel, to address all of you.
Thank you very much, and a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me thank the conveners of this workshop for convening this, and let me also thank President's Council, Salya, President of the Bar Association of Sri Lanka, for his very kind words and for his encouragement. I particularly thank the Bar Association of Sri Lanka for their continued support of the Bar Council of the Maldives. And also I congratulate the conveners in the Bar Association of Sri Lanka on putting together such a distinguished panel and getting this workshop to ensuring that all of us are given the opportunity of listening to our distinguished panelists. I also would like to highlight, even though the disaster itself happened near Sri Lanka, in Sri Lankan waters, we all know that given our proximity, the Maldives is probably one of the first countries that is going to be adversely impacted by this. And as experts have already said, it is highly likely that given the currents, it is probably the impact might be felt as far away as Africa in Somalia. So we know, even though the proximity is to Sri Lanka, it affects all of us, especially the Maldives. And we are also hopeful that the Maldives is going to be able to take precautionary measures, and particularly taking note of the, I'm sure what will be the very valuable guidance and information that is disseminated through events such as this webinar, that we will be able to take protective measures in advance. I would like to end by once again thanking the Bar Association of Sri Lanka for their continued support of the Bar Council of the Maldives, and for, I would say, being one of the very first bar associations to reach out to the Bar Association of the Maldives when we were first constituted back in 2019, and extending the hand of friendship and support to us. We will always remain grateful for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I now call upon my co-moderator, Mr. Azeen Abdullah, to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Professor Charita Patiarachi.
Thank you, Vihara. It is now my utmost privilege to introduce Professor Charita Patiarachi. He is a leading expert in the field of sustainability and survival of the seas and oceans. He is a professor of coastal oceanography at the University of Western Australia. Professor Patiarachi is the recipient of numerous illustrious awards for his efforts in research. He works tirelessly in the spreading of his wealth of knowledge through his many publications. Professor Patiarachi, I would now like to humbly call upon you to enlighten us with your words of wisdom.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, sir, we can clearly hear you.
I'm going to share my screen. You can see a full screen with the title?
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you today. I'm going to give you a little bit of an oceanographic perspective, but a little bit of my, not background, but how we deal with these kind of incidents. And I will finish off with a case study, which is now going to the courts, which is in the Australian system. So to start off, I would like to acknowledge Dr. Sarath Wijayaratna from UWA and Dr. Asha DeVos. They have all contributed to this presentation. So let's go back and look at the big picture. You know, in disasters, good science is critical. And I will explain what the good science is. And this placard, which was sent to me recently, is very noted, and it has a lot of truth in it. As every disaster movie that you watch, the storyline is such that the government is ignoring a scientist, and then in the end, the scientist is right. And then we're trying to mitigate. And first of all, please, we can eat the seafood. Every day I have many phone calls from my family, from relatives and friends asking me whether it is safe to eat seafood. It's almost 2 months since the event. You can safely eat any of the seafood. So what do we mean by good science? Good science is based by evidence. And all of you in the law fraternity know what evidence is. Evidence is also leading to proof. So if we look at in some of the major disasters in the Indian Ocean, and all of these I have been involved with, the 2004 tsunami and the follow-up tsunamis, and it resulted in development of a tsunami warning system, which is now operating. And my component was to do all of the modeling and the simulation, which is in here, and training people around the Indian Ocean rim to how to use modeling and how to use the warnings. But really, we're still not prepared, because a lot of the data for all of the Indian Ocean countries are still not available almost 20 years later. I'll talk a little bit about the 2014 Malaysian Airlines. Most of you probably heard about it. 2020, we had 2 oil spills in Mauritius and Sri Lanka. We talk about Express Pearl, and this image at the bottom, I don't know any of you heard about it, that was in January this year. A cement ship ran aground in the Little Basl Reef on the southeast of Sri Lanka. It ran aground, but they managed to free it, and there was no damage with that system. Now, can you see what's common in all of those little points that I'm talking about? And unfortunately, the work I do with all of these is a very small percentage of the actual work I do day to day. But nobody's really interested in the work that I do day to day. People, just like all of you, inviting me because you're interested in actually listening to death and destruction. That is what motivates people. In all of these, I have been on TV everywhere around the world about talking about disasters and what happens and deaths. In many places, people say, why do you actually talk about death and destruction? And one of these is because that is what people are interested in. People are not interested in the science that I do, that I sent robots from Australia to Sri Lanka lasting 11 months. That never makes the news. What makes the news is these ones. But again, it's very hard as a scientist to try to convince people to a certain extent. So most of you, you heard about the missing search for the MH370, disappeared on 8th of March, and we're still looking for it. Now, when the ship went, when the plane, working in ships and planes, same thing for oceanographer. So we if the plane was basically disappeared in the Southeast Indian Ocean, any debris that would end up in Madagascar. We said that in August 2014. In fact, nobody believed us. The official government Australian news or advice was in July 2015, debris will end up in Indonesia. However much I told them that can't happen, nobody would listen to us. It can't happen because there's a very strong current which comes from the Pacific through between Indonesia and Australia and will move everything here. Australian government requested the Indonesian government to go and search. So the whole military operation was put forward by the Indonesians to go and find the debris. And of course, they didn't find anything. And then about at the end of July 2015, this flaperon ended up in Mauritius. And that actually was from our modeling. We could actually show that the debris that would come up in that location where we think the plane crashed would actually come up and end up in the Indian Ocean around Madagascar, Mauritius, etc. So then when we started doing our modeling, and we were trying to pinpoint where these debris would end up in. So where all of these white dots is where people we have directed and gone and picked up debris. Again, people on CNN, etc., said that they were claiming that I was collaborating with the people on the ground to go and leave debris from planes from the deserts in Arizona for them to be found. So it's all about fake news because it does not match people's narrative. Good science is what I'm talking about. Okay. Now, Mauritius, we had an oil spill in Mauritius in last August. The day after it happened, day after the oil spill happened, people in the Mauritius government contacted me and said, please help. So again, the problem was that the ship actually ran aground and the government and the officials were trying to figure out what to do. A big storm came along and then the oil spill happened. So they could have actually done something very quickly, but they waited, and that was the result. Now the ship originated from Singapore, and it was basically, that was the track it came in the Mauritius over here. And normally, most of the ships would either go to the north of the island or to the south of the island. The red line is where the ship went. So it basically went directly to the island. Now, why did it do that? It did that because the ship's captain wanted to find an internet connection so that he can speak to his mistress. So completely human error ended up of having a shipping disaster. So here was the, and all of these were aquaculture sites, etc. So we were asked to do modeling. So this is the oil spill, which is happening, and then the tide is moving it back and forth. They were really worried about this part of the island because that's where most of the tourist systems was. And we could very confidently say that those areas would not be affected. But again, there was no loss of life in here, but the tugs, which were basically used to clean the oil, was towing and going to the north of the island, and the towing barge basically in a wave rested on top of the tug and sunk it, and 4 lives were lost. So disasters. In all of these, a lot of things happen at the same time. And most of you would have heard about the new diamond, which was in September last year. So that's the ship, and then you actually see the spill in the background. And then again, we were doing simulations. And the interesting thing here is that here is the Sri Lanka. That's the location of the ship. This is where we thought the oil would end up in. And because it was the end of the southwest monsoon, and the currents were going, which is the arrows that you see, was transporting any spill away from the Sri Lankan lands. So that was a lucky situation in that case. So now we go to Express Pearl. So the Express Pearl departed Hazira on the 15th of May, and it came to the Indian port. Sorry, it left Qatar, came to Indian port, and then came to Sri Lanka. So it arrived in Sri Lanka on 19th of May. So this weekend will mark 2 months. There was smoke from the hull was seen on the 20th of May. There was an explosion on the 22nd of May. The ship caught fire on the 24th of May, and a loud explosion was heard on the 25th of May. And then the fire burned for 13 days. And ultimately, they wanted to tow the ship out, but it rested on the seabed on the 2nd. So why do you think the shortest way to come to Sri Lanka would be along the Indian coastline? Why did it go offshore? Because there was a cyclone. The cyclone Tautari, which is shown in blue, was actually on the path. And so the ship actually had to go into the deeper water offshore and come to Sri Lanka. So lots of ifs and buts. And if that cyclone was not there, maybe the ship would have come maybe 1 or 2 days earlier, and maybe they could have done enough work to actually not have the incident. But these are ifs and buts. But that's the first cyclone, which is affecting our discussion. I'll talk to you a little bit later afterwards. So now, the current and the oceanographic conditions during this time, the southwest monsoon, is that we have the West Indian coastal current, which comes along south tip of India, along the south coast of Sri Lanka, and then it does a recirculation, which we call the Sri Lanka Dome, and then part water goes north as the East Indian coastal current. In the Gulf of Mannar, we have a recirculation. We get some water in there, and we will now see later on is that recirculation, which is most likely going to retain a lot of the noodles, which is the plastic pellets, in this region for some time. The winds we had was offshore, and the waves were coming from the southwest. So we do computer simulations. So we put all of the information that we have globally from different satellites, different data sets, we put it into a computer and we solve Newton's second law. And that gives us information. So here on the left is the currents. The arrows are showing the currents and the colors are magnitude. So near to the coastline, you can see Negombo, you can see Colombo. The currents are weaker, and then you have the stronger currents further offshore. So it's about 20 kilometers away. When we look at a satellite image, you see the same thing, that this water that you can see coming around off the south of southern India, you see the recirculation. But what I wanted to show you is this band of, in this particular case, high chlorophyll and sediment corresponds to that narrow band of water that we see just off our coast. So that is the water which is turbid. So then we can actually put particles in the water and to simulate the noodles. So we started putting them, you can see the magenta point to see where the noodles would end up. So on the 25th May, you can see they would come almost onto the beach, which is where we saw very large accumulations in Pamanugam, etc. And then very quickly, that went away and to the south. And when we started off with a very small system and then we realized that this is not big enough. We need to go much larger. So now we see how these noodles are moving across. On the top, you see the dates. So over a month, and then you would see currents strengthening out here and then moving them back into the west coast. And then you also see them going to the north. There's recirculation. You can see this, the difference between the red and the white is that the red is at the surface and the white is at 5 meter water depth. So you can see on the top, we're going just starting July, you can see how it has going through. Now, usually, as I said, most of the water would come from southern India, across Sri Lanka, and all the way through. Just remember this part here, that the noodles actually detach from the coast, and there is no noodles ending up on the south coast. So this was the second cyclone, which was a problem, which affected us. So Cyclone Yas crossed the coast to the north of Visakhapatnam, and that creates a wave, a slow moving water level change, which basically comes along the Indian coastline, around Sri Lanka, and to Colombo and up. And when we look at the sea level at Trincomalee, you can see how this, where I have drawn this line, which is that the non-tidal water level, as you say, you see is decreasing and going up, and same signal in Colombo, except that the signal in Colombo is a little bit later, which is showing allows for the water to basically come around. And that's really that strong currents that you see here coming through is due to that cyclone driven current. So this could be hundreds of kilometers away, but it is affecting Sri Lanka. So when we look at satellite images, we see exactly the same. On the 1st of June, you can see this water, the lower colored water, it's low chlorophyll going here, and then in the next one, the next day, it's pushing it further out. When we look at different images, you see a lot of these movements going back and forth along the south coast. So now we go on to looking at, very quickly, we saw the high concentrations of nodules along the west coast, and it was detaching from the coast and going offshore. And then this water came from the other side and pushed it all back up north. And of course, you're losing a lot. So we can do a budget. This is on the 11th of June. We could say that if there was 100% of the nodules released, but 32% was beached, ended up on the beaches, 28% were within the Sri Lankan coastal area, and 40% was outside this box I'm showing you. So they travel very rapidly, very far. So roughly, if you want to say, a third and a third and a third. And then we were, Asha DeVos developed a sort of a citizen science to look at where the nodules were coming up. And that's her, the website. If you go to that, you will see where the plastic pellets or nodules were found around Sri Lanka. If you look at this one, there is a gap, and that gap is where I told you that the currents were detaching and going offshore. That's why there is. And then they come back, and you will see at Arugam Bay, Palutupana, etc. Today, we heard that they have identified nodules in Trincomalee and Pulmude. When the monsoons change, you will have all of that water, beaches covered and coming back into the system. So this, again, I wanted to show that missing part because the currents are quite different in that people. And we get lots of reports. We got this report to say they found some nodules in Goa in India in the on the west coast. Unlikely because the currents and the winds are completely in the opposite direction. So what would happen to these nodules? So we can think and give you a simulation of nodules, let's say they're on that square. And if we do a simulation of where those nodules will end up, this is where you will see. It will cover whole of the northern Indian Ocean and Maldives, Madagascar, Thailand, Indonesia, India. Remember, every year there is a reversal of the currents. So you would have these nodules going back and forth all the time. This morning, we had reports of nodules being found in Thailand. We're just waiting for confirmation, so they already had. Our models basically were saying that they would get to Indonesia and Thailand within 2 to 3 months. So we are in the early days here. So most of you live in Sri Lanka, obviously would have experienced a big storm last Saturday. And that storm brought lots and lots of noodles on shore. And this will keep happening. Some of these noodles would be buried on the beaches, but the storms, when they come, they will resuscitate. So we will basically see these noodles, evidence of this for decades to come. They are persistent in the ocean. So this is the storm, this is the wave height. So this is Saturday. The waves basically were very calm. About this time last week, went up to almost 3.5 meters, and then came down and remaining. So that's the noodle story. Then lots of people were talking about, oh yes, there has been an oil spill. Again, people always get into this and look at this and say, oh yeah, you can actually see it. You have to remember that this is a ship which has been burnt. There's a lot of debris, lot of ash and everything in the system. So the waves act as like a washing machine. They keep washing all of this. So there is going to be different colored water, but not necessarily oil. So to date, we don't know, there has not been a major oil spill. There's possibly about 300 tons of bunker oil still on the ship. We don't know whether that has been burnt or not, but it's a possibility still. But if there was a spill, so this was what we did right at the beginning, on the 3rd of June, if the oil spill was there, we would not actually had a contact with the coast. Because I showed you the currents going north and south, so the ship is there, it would basically be moving north. And then in a different way, you see exactly the same in terms of a extension of the plume northwards. Again, depending on these currents and waves at that particular times and winds. What happened to the chemical spill? People talking about and saying that there are 27 tons of nitric acid on the ship, actually 16 cubic meters in volume. And here is a simulation of where that nitric acid would go if it was spilled into the ocean. Now we're using a model, and what we are showing you is dilution rate. And if you look at the scale closely, it starts at 6 million. So in any material which came out in the liquid form from the ship would have been diluted 6 million times within 2 hours. What does that mean? We all understand what a teaspoon looks like. We're also familiar with the bathtub. If we put 1 teaspoon in 100 bathtubs, that is the dilution. In fact, our day-to-day life, we go and measure the salinity in the water, how very, very accurately. But that accuracy is within 1 million parts. And this is 6 million. There is no instrument in the world which we could have taken and measured to see whether there was any residual chemicals in the water. The dilution is huge. And that's the science that we have to think about. And all of the ones that we're talking about in that list, if they were in liquid form, that's the situation. People said there was urea, and that would contribute to harmful algal blooms. But we never had a harmful algal bloom in Sri Lanka. How can you have an algal bloom when we don't have any of the species which have this thing? You know, the urea on this ship is a very small percentage of the amount of urea and the fertilizer that we put in from our rivers. Take the example for Mahawe, which comes north of Negombo. For 2 or 3 months of the year, the river is closed to the ocean. So all that fertilizer comes in and is stuck in the river. And then rainfall even comes, we push it out. Happens 2 or 3 times a year. Have you ever seen an algal bloom? No way. One reason also is that we have high turbidity. So you need light. So the idea that, yes, so all these people in the scientists, they go through a shopping list and say, this is going to happen. The coral reefs are going to dissolve. 1 million dilution, then you can't even find it. You could actually go and test the urine in a swimming pool much better than you can go and find the amount of chemicals in the ocean as a result of this shit. So the nurdles, we think that maybe up to 3 billion nurdles distributed along the Indian Ocean, and it will remain for many decades. They are non-toxic. I can eat them. It will come out of the other side. It won't do me any harm. It can populate by bacteria and contaminants into the future, assuming that there are those contaminants in the water. We know fish and other marine fauna may be killed only through suffocation, such as these images that I showed you in terms of the fish. We already ingest lots of plastic in our diet. Do you know how much plastic you may be eating in your rice and your lentils and your salt from the atmosphere, the clothes that you wear? That's nothing to compare to these ones in here. People say the coral reefs are going to be affected. The nurdles float. The coral reefs are on the bottom. There is no contact between the two. They cannot harm. And after the initial thing, now 2 months later, the concentrations of the nurdles are so low across the ocean that it's not going to have any effects at all. That's why you can safely eat seafood, because the fish which maybe digest and they don't digest. So if a fish large enough is able to eat a nurdle, it will come out the other end. Here is an example. This is a study which looked at different types of plastics and how they would actually create deaths. The closest that I could find was plastic fragments with sharp edges. You've seen the nurdles, they're circular, very few deaths. The biggest deaths come from film-like plastics. These are degraded bags, plastic bags like this. This is from Indonesian bags coming into Australia. And these plastic fragments, we don't have anything like that. So impacts from a hazardous material, chemical sprints, we don't know how much, but they're highly diluted. There's no major spill to date. And we talk about turtle deaths. Majority of these deaths are unlikely to be due to express pearl, but we still have to reserve judgment on that. We went to the results of the postmortems for proof. Look at the geographic distribution. First of all, I look at Batticaloa. How can the ship affect turtles in Batticaloa? Geographic distribution. It's dilution effects that I talked about. Why then, if there were hazardous material, only marine mammals died? There is no large-scale fish kills. So again, it's a question we have to answer. Now, quickly to finish off, YM efficiency is a very similar incident to express pearl, except it roughly had 2,200 cargo. It had basically rough weather, lost 81 containers overboard. There were about 30 kilometers offshore, and it was registered in Liberia, and it is insured by Britannia P&I, which is exactly the same insurers of the express pearl. So this is what the beaches look like. That's Nelson Bay. This is where the ship actually happened. 83 containers fell off, and you can see people cleaning up. A lot of these doesn't look like noodles because the ship was carrying empty empty containers for creams and chip packets, bottles, bicycles, whole cars. And then the Australian Marine Safety Authority, which is equivalent to MPPA, actually went and recovered using cranes and ROVs these containers from the seafloor. So the marine people did that, and there were 1,000 tons of debris was cleared. And then the Australian government attempted to engage with the owners, and they wanted to recover the cost incurred. And then the Yang Ming and his insurer took the position that the containers and associated material does not constitute pollution. And that was because Australia is not a signatory to the Nairobi Convention for Removal of Wrecks. Sri Lanka is not either. And at the moment, the Australian government has filed action in the Supreme Court, and the hearing is set for December this year, 3.5 years after the event. So in terms of compensation, there's cost recovery for firefighting, control, and cleanup. There's compensation in terms of loss of livelihood. People couldn't actually go out to sea because it was unsafe. There's environmental damage, which we need proof and to be able to, and then the removal of the ship and the containers. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Patiarachi, for your very informative graphics and wise words. I now pass the controls over to Mr. Nusri Hussain to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Azim. Our next speaker today is Dr. Lalanath De Silva. Dr. De Silva is the incumbent head of the independent redress mechanism of the Green Climate Fund, which is the main funding mechanism under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Dr. De Silva is a distinguished academic and was awarded the Humphrey Fellowship and followed an LLM in Marine Affairs at the University of Washington. Dr. De Silva also holds a PhD from the University of Sydney. Dr. De Silva will today address on the applicable international environmental laws, concepts and principles, and rights of affected communities. Dr. De Silva, I invite you to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Nusri. I need to share my screen. Thank you. Great. Can you hear me? Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, sir, we can hear you clearly.
Thank you. So, hello, everybody. Good to be here with all of you and colleagues. And thank you very much to Professor Patiarachi for that, I think, very good introduction to the facts and science surrounding this particular incident. My task today is to set an overall picture, if you like, a framework for what is to follow by other colleagues who will present after me. And to that end, I thought I would share with you some thoughts on the legal implications of this incident. Let me start by referring to some of the broad applicable environmental law concepts that are applicable here. Oh, and one other thing, just before I start, I must put in a caveat to say that, yes, I work at the Green Climate Fund, but what I say today is in my personal capacity as a Sri Lankan attorney. It does not represent anything that the Green Climate Fund believes in or its own policies. And so just to be clear that this is a presentation in my personal capacity, and I do not represent the fund today. So coming back, applicable environmental laws and concepts, there are four broad ideas that I want to put before you. And these are ideas that are, or concepts that are generally applicable across the board in environmental law at the international level and also in many national jurisdictions. Of course, at the international level, there is the general obligation of flag and coastal states to do due diligence with regard to what has happened. So you obviously have Sri Lanka, which is the coastal state immediately impacted, although there are other states like the Maldives and other states like Thailand, as Dr. Patiarach said, who may be impacted as well. But the primary impact is on Sri Lanka, and you can see that the coastal state has certain due diligence obligations under various international conventions and as well as under national law, Sri Lankan law. And these include, of course, taking preventive action to prevent further damage. The ship is sitting there with a large number of containers to ensure that those are kept secure and, to the extent possible, removed as quickly as possible. I understand that efforts are afoot to salvage the vessel. However, the monsoons apparently are preventing it from happening quickly enough, quicker than we would like to see it happen. And I'm saying this on the strength of a press conference that the relevant minister and the MIPA, the relevant Marine Environment Pollution Prevention Authority and the Central Environmental Authority gave recently. So that is the preventive side, and then of course in somewhat longer term there is the restorative actions that are necessary by way of due diligence to restore the environment to the extent necessary and possible, and then of course to seek compensation from the ship owner and if necessary from the fund. We'll talk a little bit about all of that in a minute. So those are some of the due diligence that needs to be done. Certainly there'll have to be compensation for if there have been loss of fisheries or loss of livelihood, etc. Those will have to be, those people who suffered need to be compensated as well. So that's part of the due diligence that would be expected from the Sri Lankan government. Then of course there's the flag state, which is Singapore as I understand it. And so there are some obligations that are cast on flag states to ensure that the vessels are seaworthy and so on, to that proper inspections are conducted of its ability to deal with hazardous substances if those are being carried, and that there is preparedness for these kinds of fires and disasters on board the ship. So those are some of the due diligence obligations generally in international and national environmental law. The second idea that I think we should be aware of is what's called the precautionary principle. This is both a principle of science, but also a principle now, increasingly a principle of law as well. So generally, the precautionary principle suggests that if in doubt, you would decide in favor of the environment. In other words, you would decide on the side of precaution. So let's say you are faced with a situation in which there is some scientific evidence, but not enough to conclusively say that something is going to happen or not happen. In that situation, if it does happen, will that harm the environment? If it doesn't happen, will it not harm the environment? If so, then in that situation of doubt, you would decide in favor of the environment. Just as in a criminal case, the element of doubt would result in a favorable decision to the accused. Here, the element of doubt should ideally result in a favorable decision to the environment so that we can preserve and protect the environment simply because we are in doubt. So that's a general principle that has been accepted both in national and many national jurisdictions, including here in Sri Lanka and India for sure, both in fundamental rights and other applications. But it is also a principle of science. The next broad principle that I want to refer to is the polluter pays principle. This is in a sense more of an economic principle, which is basically says that if somebody pollutes the environment, that person should pay the cost of cleanup. So what happened, or what has been happening in the past, is because of the whole dilemma of the commons, as we say. You know, the air is common to all of us, and the ocean is common to all of us. The rivers were thought to be common to all of us. So what happened was people would then, discharge their waste into the river because it gets washed away. They don't see it. Out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. But eventually all of that waste accumulates somewhere and pollutes the environment. Then there is loss and damage. And ultimately the taxpayer, the government, has to clean that up. And so the taxpayer ends up cleaning it. This principle basically cuts across that and says, no, If there's cleanup as a result of what you've done, then you will have to pay for it. So that's the polluter pays principle. Again, this is a principle generally embedded in several conventions, including some relating to shipping disasters like the one we've seen, but also in particular now accepted in many natural jurisdictions through case law, both in India and elsewhere. And the last point I want to make is, as we look at laws, whether national or international, it's important to try to understand the meaning of pollution, the meaning of harm, and the meaning of damage as lawyers. There are sometimes slightly differing definitions used in different conventions and laws. And so to get a good handle on what exactly these terms mean, pollution generally means, if you have this material sitting on the ship, then that is not pollution. But the moment it hits the water, then it can become pollution. Harm is a fairly broad term, which means that some adverse impact has taken place. And damage tends to be a little bit more legalistic in that we are looking at actually quantifiable damages. And this raises the whole question of how do you quantify damage to an ecosystem or to ecosystem services? The ocean supplies us with a lot of services, and as do other environmental elements, and the air, the water that we have in the rivers and so on and so forth, the forests, they all supply us with services, and these services go unaccounted for and unquantified. So how do we actually quantify them? And increasingly, resource economists have now come up with methods of how to do that, and we may have to resort to some of that in calculating the costs in calculating the compensation that the government may wish to claim. So with that, let me move. I want to now very quickly cover some of the international conventions that might have a bearing on this situation. I'm very sorry to hear that Dr. Ruantis is not joining our webinar today because he was due to deal in some depth with these international conventions. I will only today be touching very, very briefly on, because there is a large number of conventions that are applicable, and it's pretty much a mosaic of international conventions, and some of them overlap. So there's really no time to deal with them in detail, but I will quickly try to run through them. What you see here shaded in green are conventions that Sri Lanka are party to. What is in blue, we are not a party to. And some of those are in blue, which are important. Unfortunately, we are not a party to. And this is something that perhaps we need to agitate with the government to ensure that we become party to this, because clearly we have three big harbors now. We have the Colombo harbor, we have the Hambantota harbor, and we have now, of course, the old Trincomalee harbor. And there are ships flying up and down all around our coast, except perhaps the north, because of the Pork Strait. Ships don't go across there very much. But everywhere else, there are plenty of ships going up and down all the time, heavy traffic, and it's very likely that there are going to be such incidents. And so we really need to ensure that we are party to all the right conventions and treaties so that we can gain their benefit. So here we go. Let's start at the top. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS, of 1974. We have ratified that, but we have not ratified the protocols or agreements under SOLAS. So there is a gap there in our international law here for Sri Lanka. And this is the convention basically which regulates what ships should carry, the safety equipment, qualifications of staff, and that kind of thing. The next convention, and this is a very important convention, which is MARPOL, or referred to as MARPOL, is the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, 1973, as modified by the protocols of 78 relating thereto, and by the protocol of 1997. This has been ratified, and there are 6 annexes, of which 5 of them have been ratified by us. The 6th convention perhaps is important, but not, maybe Sri Lanka hasn't ratified it yet, but it deals with air pollution from ships. And so, but it's really the annexes 1 to 5 that are critical. And these annexes deal with different aspects, including oil pollution and hazardous material pollution from hazardous materials from ships, and so on and so forth. They refer to the various steps that should be taken in the event that these incidents happen, who should be notified, what kind of assistance should be rendered, the obligations of states with regard to the various accidents and spills that have happened, and so on and so forth. The next convention is the International Convention relating to the intervention on the high seas in cases of oil pollution casualties, or intervention as it's called, of 69. We have ratified that, but we have not ratified the 73 protocol. Again, that's something that needs to be looked into. This is a convention that deals with how one can intervene in the high seas. Now, this incident didn't happen in the high seas, it happened in territorial waters. But as I said, in the future, that can always happen because there are lots of ships flying around right next to our economic, the economic zone, as well as our territorial waters. The last one on this slide is the International Convention on Oil Pollution Preparedness, Response and Cooperation, or OPRC, of 1990. It's a fairly recent convention. This we have not ratified, though the flag state Singapore has ratified it. So that's an important difference to note. And this is a convention that basically talks about the preparedness of countries that should be prepared for these kinds of events. And oddly enough, we do have a response plan that has been prepared by the agency, the authority, the Marine Environmental Pollution Prevention Authority. It is a little, it is some years old, but it does designate the Ports Authority, the Navy, the Coast Conservation Department, and other agencies like that to be the first responders. And there is, it does talk about what kinds of equipment need to be kept on board, etc. But in my own reading of it is that it is a little bit dated. It needs to be updated, and certainly I do not think it is adequate given the kinds of incidents that have happened recently that Dr. Patiarach was talking about. My next set of slides, again, a few more conventions, and I'll run through this very quickly given the time limit. Protocol on Preparedness, Response and Cooperation to Pollution Incidents by Hazardous and Noxious Substances. So as you might have noticed, the last one on the previous list was on oil pollution preparedness. This protocol basically extended the OPRC to cover hazardous and noxious substances. That was done in 2000. Unfortunately, we are not a party to it, although the flag state Singapore is. Then there is a 1992 protocol to the International Convention on the establishment of an international fund for compensation for oil pollution damage. This is an important fund. At the end of the day, if we do not recover enough compensation from the ship owners, then there is a possible recourse to this fund. And the fund, although we do have recourse to the fund, we may not get as much as we really need to get to the fund, because it is a collective fund to which countries contribute, and there are limits on how much can be paid out of the fund. We have ratified that, but again, there's a protocol of 2003 we have not ratified. The next on the list is the International Convention on the Liability and Compensation for Damage in Connection with the Carriage of Hazardous and Noxious Substances by Sea, 96. And its protocol of 2010. We have not ratified this. This is again a convention that deals with compensation for damage in the event of hazardous and noxious substances. So if there were any of those on board, then and those spilled, then that is where this convention would come into operation. Now, to be honest with you, I do not know the detailed facts or the ship's manifest to know what exactly was on board, or to know how much of it spilled into the sea to be able to say what exactly hit the water. But this is a matter for scientists to look at and to tell us whether there is a schedule in this convention which lists all the hazardous and noxious substances, whether any of that got into the water and whether those would have impacts. Then there is the Law of the Sea Convention, of course, which we have ratified, which has a number of clauses dealing with pollution from these kinds of incidents. And then the last one I want to mention is the International Convention on Civil Liability for Oil Pollution Damage. This is an important convention. We originally denounced the 1969 convention. There were a number of countries that did that for various reasons. I won't go into right now. But then we did ratify the 76 protocol because this protocol set right some of the things that were problematic in the 69 convention. But there is a 92 update which we have not, which we have now ratified. So this is this convention is important because this is the convention that actually deals with how we can recover damages or compensation for what has happened with regard to this incident. So those are the whole bunch of conventions. There are several others I have not listed here because partly because I thought they may be less directly applicable here. But this is a specialized area of environmental law that that requires specialist attention. So just to be clear about that. I now want to get very quickly to the general government actions or basic government actions that we can expect under this international conventions, but also perhaps to some extent under national law, which I believe one of my colleagues will be dealing with later on, the national law situation. And again, I phrase this in a very general way because the evidence is still coming in, investigations are still underfoot. And so I think it would be unfair to try to pinpoint them with greater clarity or specificity. And so what I've done is to try to generalize here. So the first action, of course, is urgent preventive action, and that is the action that was taken to put the fire out. There will be questions around: was that adequate? Was that done properly, etc. But also preventive action now to ensure that the bunker oil that is said to be sitting in the ship doesn't leak out. I'm told by the government at the government press conference that daily water samples are being taken around, and then a number of other steps are being taken to monitor the situation of the ship as it sits there. So that is the urgent preventive action that has probably already now been taken after 2 months. Urgent restorative action. So some of these actions would involve, for example, cleaning the beaches, collecting the noodles that were washed ashore. I'm told that many container loads of these noodles have been collected and stored away. They are being preserved, so says the government, because they may be required for future research to find out what exactly these noodles were made up of and what their properties and how they act in the environment and so on. So those are being preserved, which is the right thing to do. And other restorative action would be, of course, to look at what other impacts might have happened both on the coast, but also as some might be alleging on the coral reefs, although we heard from Dr. Patiarachi, there probably that's not an issue to worry about. But those are the kinds of restorative actions, urgent ones, that need to be taken and have, to some extent been already taken. Now, this is a very important one, and perhaps Professor Patiarachi and others may have some comment on this. It is very important to establish baselines for social, economic, and environmental damage. And this is a very important thing that the government needs to do. I'm told, again, at the press conference, the government did say that they have plenty of data to show livelihood losses, etc., because the Fisheries Department has regular census and collection of data about the fishing families that live along the coast, how much fish they catch, what kinds of species are being caught, and so on and so forth. So maybe those baselines do exist, but it is important to make sure that they are pretty good and robust. But there will also be other kinds of baselines to look at. For example, as we clean the beaches, did we take account of, or if there were dead fish and dead turtles, did we take species counts? Did we take a question, looked at the density of how many species were washing up, say in a square meter? I'm just giving a figure here, square meter of the seashore. What kinds of what were the reasons? Postmortems carried out on these dead animals that were washing up to know exactly why they died, whether the noodles had something to do with it, or whether they just died out of natural causes or because of the monsoon, because the monsoon does create some of that as well. So these kinds of baselines for socio-economic and environmental damage need to be established. They should have been started on day one as things were getting cleaned up, but they should certainly continue right now as well, because we will need that information and evidence in order to ground compensation and other claims. Investigate and prosecute criminal liability. I understand this will be dealt with in greater depth later on, but clearly, was there a criminal culpability on the side of the ship captain, on the side of the crew, was there any criminal negligence on their side, or on the side of other government officials who got the information, did they act properly, etc. Those kinds of things, I understand, are being investigated by the CID and others, and those need to be done carefully and properly so that criminal culpability can be assessed and, if necessary, prosecuted. And then there is, of course, civil and environmental liability. We need to investigate that and pursue those civil remedies. Of course, we will have to claim against the insurer. We will have to claim against, we'll have claims against the ship owner with regard to this damage. And indeed, there might be other civil claims arising out of the loss of the containers and so on and so forth, the carriage of goods violations, and whatever other civil obligations the ship itself might have had. Those will also have, they will also happen. But I'm talking about government actions here. So we're really referring to the environmental damage. And this is not just the damage, cost of cleaning up the beaches, but if there is ecosystem damage, then that has to be assessed using ecosystem damage assessment methods. A few more: plan and implement long-term restoration. So if there is a need for long-term restoration, and I'm no scientist, so I don't pretend to know whether that is required, but somebody like Professor Pattiarach or the scientists knowledgeable about the marine, Sri Lankan marine system would be in a better position to answer this question. But that is a question that needs to be answered. Claim compensation from the ship owner, the fund, the insurer, etc. These are different kinds of compensation claims that will have to be lodged. They have to be adequate. They need to cover the loss of livelihood and impacts on fisherfolk, etc., who clearly lost business immediately after the ship, ran aground and burnt. There was a period of time they couldn't go out, fishing, and things were washing up on the beach. So there is loss, and those have to be calculated. And once compensation is received, they need to be disbursed to the right people. Assess if there is recourse against the flag state. This is very remote. Generally, states don't, we are not going to sue Singapore over this incident, but there is some limited recourse available. I'm just flagging it here because for completeness. Establish local compensation scheme. This is very important from a community perspective. That the scheme must be established. If necessary, the government should advance the funds before compensation is paid and try to, because these are mostly very poor people, and poor people are affected in their livelihoods, then they tend to borrow and get, raise funds through usury interest rates, and then they get into more difficulty and find themselves. And then I'm coming to the end of my presentation here. So implement long-term restoration. So that's the plan and implement the long-term restoration. I think I already mentioned that. Finally, a quick word about community action. What can the community, particularly affected fishermen and others, tourist hotels who might have been affected? Apparently, tourists stopped coming because of the beach being polluted and so on. We have to look into the accuracy of these kinds of statements and see whether there is evidence to support that. What can we do? There is actually, in many ways, and I've looked at some cases that have been brought in other countries, somewhat limited availability of legal remedies, given that the state is acting on behalf of these communities as the patria potestas or the great father, so to say. Who would claim compensation and then should take steps to distribute appropriate amounts to the affected parties. So there is literally very limited availability of legal remedies. For example, a fishing community, can they sue the ship owner? I suppose technically they can, but do they have the wherewithal to do though? And on one hand, you have a big shipping company which will fight with a lot of resources at their end, versus a small fishing community who will not have those resources. So it's very unlikely to happen, and also legal remedies are somewhat limited in these circumstances. Provide information to the government on damages. This is very important. I think people who have suffered damages should inform the government of those damages. The government in the press conference actually did say so. And so I believe there's a hotline that's been opened. So maybe those are ways in which people can be encouraged to let the government know that this is how I suffered, this is the quantification of what I suffered, and here's the proof. Ensure compensation scheme is established. This is very important. From a community perspective, it is very important to keep pushing the government to establish this scheme quickly and to disperse the funds quickly. And if that doesn't happen, there may be potential recourse to the courts, either by way of a judicial review or perhaps even fundamental rights or other remedies, civil remedies that may be available to people who have suffered. But it is important to keep pushing the government to do that. Civil suits for damages are very doubtful, as I said at the beginning, and so I just flagged that. I'm not saying it is impossible, but I think they are full of challenges. And ensure future preparedness is improved. This is very important. I think we all as lawyers, but also as a community, should ensure that we push our government to be properly prepared. I do not think that we have been properly prepared for many of the disasters that have happened in the recent past. There's a lot of scrambling going on. We do not have the right kinds of equipment, but we are an island nation sitting at the bottom of India in a very busy seafaring route, and we therefore should be properly prepared to deal with this issue, these kinds of issues, with 3 harbors sitting right around the country. And I don't think we are where we should be. So this is something that we can certainly push the government to do, and maybe through legal means as well, whether they be through judicial review actions, look at what the Marine Pollution Authority has done. Have they done adequately? If not, mandamus may lie, other remedies, fundamental rights, and so on and so forth. And then finally, bring accountability to government. I think that last sentence literally covers everything I've said so far, but basically ensure that the government does what is properly required of them under the international and national laws. And that can be done both through non-legal means, political and other means, and just by working with the government, but also, of course, through legal means such as litigation. So there ends my presentation. Thank you very much. I cannot stay for the whole webinar. I will be here for a little while longer, and then I have to quit, and I have another workshop in about half an hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. De Silva, for joining us today, and thank you for your speech. Now I would hand over the controls to my co-moderator, Shanila Fonseca. Shanila?
Thank you, Nazri. Mr. Bandari is our next speaker, and Mr. Bandari is a qualified lawyer in Singapore and Malaysia. He is the deputy head of the Shipping and International Trade Practice Group at Raja & Tan, Singapore LLP, a partner of Raja & Tan's Malaysian associate office, Christopher and Lee Ong, and a director of Raja & Tan's Myanmar Company Limited. Mr. Bandari is also a partner at the Singapore Chamber of Maritime Arbitration. Mr. Bandari, I now invite you to share a few words with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think first of all, I would like to convey my thanks to the Sri Lankan and Maldives Bar Association for their kind invite for me to speak today. And I have some slides, and I will just start sharing my screen. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get the... Can you see the screen?
Yes, sir, we can see the screen.
Okay, because I wasn't sure that you could see what I'm sharing. Right. In the course of about 20 minutes or so, I will just touch on 3 areas. The first is the Singapore experience in handling oil and chemical spills. I've been asked to say something about how Singapore would handle a similar disaster that if it had occurred here. Secondly, the recovery of claims arising from the Express Pearl disaster. Again here, I will outline the applicable international conventions that are in force in Singapore, and briefly deal with the liability provisions. And lastly, I was actually asked or invited to speak here by the Singapore Chamber of Maritime Arbitration. So I will just very briefly touch on how the SCMA can help in resolving some of these claims. Right. Maybe I'll start off with a bit of history because, as you know, Singapore is situated right in the middle of very busy waterways. Both the Malacca Straits and the Straits of Singapore are some of the busiest waterways in the world. And Singapore is also the site of many oil refineries and it's a major bunkering port, right? So, you know, we've had our fair share of oil spills. And I've just outlined 3 oil spills that have occurred in the past. The first, the Voikos, which occurred in 1997, was a major disaster in the sense that it was a collision between 2 tankers, and one of which was loaded. And unfortunately, the cargo holds were breached, and a massive 28,500 metric tons of oil spilled out into the waters and contaminated the environment. So this was the worst environmental disaster that we have faced to date. And it caused a considerable pollution, not only to the southern islands, but also oil drifted into Malaysian and Indonesian waters. And then subsequently, we've had 2 more collisions, which I've outlined here. There have been many other spills as well, but I need not go into that. But just to illustrate that, you know, we've had our fair share of spills. And now, when there is a spill in Singapore, as Dr. Lalanath mentioned, Singapore has ratified the OPRC and the OPRC HNS protocol. So there is in place already a very comprehensive oil response and contingency plan to deal with such pollution. And the relevant authority is the MPA, or Maritime and Port Authority. And under these, under the laws that are in force, the MPA, because there are regulations that have been enacted under the relevant statute in Singapore, the MPA can call upon equipment, materials, manpower held by various oil companies, private enterprises, etc., to assist in the cleanup operations. So the operations will be coordinated by the MPA, and it can direct and deploy the necessary resources. And there is also in place an oil spill contingency plan where the MPA has elicited the involvement of various government and private organizations, as well as the oil majors. So depending on how serious the pollution is classified, whether it's tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3, different levels of response will be activated. Apart from that, it is also a requirement here in Singapore that operators of oil or HNS terminals must have an emergency plan in place to deal with oil or HNS incidents. And all these plans must be submitted to MPA for approval. And operating oil companies are also required to hold a certain amount of stocks of oil pollution combating equipment, which the MPA can call upon them, right, to provide these equipments to combat pollution. So things like dispersants, sprayers, booms, skimmers, etc. All these equipment are basically at the call of the MPA. And apart from that, lastly, there are also 2 oil response companies, which are private entities, which have been set up to specifically help to combat the pollution. So there is in place already a very comprehensive oil response system and plan in place in Singapore. Now, turning to the relevant conventions, the international conventions, Now, there are basically three conventions that are in force here. Three international conventions that have been enacted and have force of law in Singapore. The first is the Merchant Shipping Oil Pollution Act, and that gives effect to the 1992 Civil Liability Convention and the 1992 Fund Convention, which deals basically with oil pollution, and specifically oil pollution from tankers. The second is the Bunker Oil Pollution Act, which gives effect to the 2001 Bunker Convention. And the difference here is that the 2001 Bunker Convention basically came into force because the community realized, right, that you can have significant pollution from vessels which are not oil tankers or vessels which are not carrying oil cargo in bulk. So any other ship, container ships, you know, or even say fishing vessels, any other vessel that carries bunkers and needs to carry bunkers to operate, if the bunker leaks, then the BOPA, which gives effect to the Bunker Convention, will apply. The third statute is the Prevention of Pollution of the Sea Act, or PPSA, which gives effect to the 1973 MARPOL Convention as modified by the 1978 Protocol. And lastly, I just want to mention, and I'll elaborate a little bit more about this later, there is the HNS Convention and 2010 Protocol, but this is still not in force yet, right? Now, I mentioned the CLC Convention. Now, basically how it works is this. It establishes a two-tier compensation regime for the economic consequences of oil pollution. So claims for damages, cleanup costs, etc., that arise from the oil pollution incident, these claims would fall under the CLC and the Fund Conventions. Now, the CLC itself, the convention, would provide for the liability of the ship owner. And the fund here refers to the IOPCF fund, the International Oil Pollution Compensation Fund, which is a specific legal entity which has been set up, and it has the capacity to sue and be sued. And what happens is the oil majors or net importers or receivers of oil, right, they are obligated to make contributions to the fund depending on how much of oil they import. And the fund is then a second tier of liability, of compensation for claimants. So essentially, if the owner or the insurer cannot meet its obligations in full under the CLC Convention, or if the damage caused by the pollution, is so extensive that it exceeds the limitation amount of the ship owner, then the fund will kick in to pay the difference. So that's how the CLC and fund conventions work. But as I mentioned earlier, these conventions only apply to oil tankers, and therefore in the case of the Express Pearl incident, unfortunately these regimes would not apply because it is a container ship, which has unfortunately caused extensive harm to the environment and damage, right? So how then do we deal with bunker contamination? So that would fall under the Bunker Convention, which addresses the need to deal with the discharge of bunkers from any ship. And the Bunker Convention is also structured similarly, like the CLC Convention, but the limits of liability are different. At least in Singapore, it is different. There is a different regime, and the limits of liability are lower. And further, unlike the CLC regime, there is no additional compensation tier from a fund. So you are left then with the limit of liability that can be established under the Bunker Convention for all claims that all claims for pollution damage caused by the discharge of the bunkers. Right. The MARPOL Convention and the PPSA. Now, this statute, the PPSA, which has basically enacted a MARPOL, was actually enacted for a different purpose, in the sense that it is not meant as a compensation regime for pollution, but rather it applies to prevent pollution of the marine environment. So basically, it has a wider application in the sense that it covers not only the discharge of oil or oily mixtures, but also other harmful substances from the vessel. So it has a larger scope of application, and it will cover chemicals, including plastics, garbage, wastes, marine pollutants, harmful substances from a vessel. So these pollutants have been specifically defined. For example, the pollutants, marine pollutants, are as listed in the IMDG code. Noxious liquid substance refers to a substance prescribed as such under Annex 2 of MARPOL. And a harmful substance is defined very widely to include any substance which, if introduced into the sea, is liable to create hazards to human health and to harm living resources and marine life. So it has a very wide scope of application, and essentially it has provisions to impose criminal sanctions for the discharge of oil, oily mixtures, noxious substances, harmful substances, etc. But because it is meant for that purpose, when it comes to recovery of costs, it is unfortunately limited. And I will share that with you in a while in my next slide or next few slides. But before that, I just want to say that there is a territorial limitation to these conventions, because in Singapore, these statutes, which give effect to the conventions, only apply if the discharge occurred in Singapore waters or outside Singapore waters where the pollutant has flowed or drifted into Singapore waters. That's when these conventions will apply here. Now, turning to the disaster itself, I think, based on what I've read in the press and on the internet, I think, it's a serious environmental damage has been caused. And here, I think, just to kind of give you an idea of some of the claims that, I anticipate would occur here. Firstly, of course, naturally, you would have the cleanup costs and expenses. Then you would have the loss of income and revenue from the pollution and environmental damage. You would have not only fishermen, but also hotels, businesses, tourism industry, etc., which would be affected by the pollution if beaches have to be closed to be cleaned up. Then you would have environmental damage. I think that has been touched on also by previous speakers. And Dr. Dalanath also mentioned that when it comes to issues of quantifying the loss, it can be quite challenging because you need to prove what exactly is the environmental damage and how such damage was caused by that pollutant. I mean, if you're looking at oil pollution, for example, the bunker pollution, what environmental damage did that cause? If it is chemical pollution, what environmental damage did that pollutant cause? If it's plastics, what did it cause? So these issues can be quite challenging. Then apart from such claims, you also would have claims that arise from the contracts of carriage of the cargo assumed by the ship owner. In this case, as you know, the ship owner, the ship is already has sunk, I believe. It's a total loss, or at least a CTL, and the contracts of carriage can't be performed, and there would be claims under bills of lading issued by the ship owner, under contracts of under charter parties entered into for the vessel. So this would be another category of claims. And lastly, of course, you would have the salvors who would be claiming for salvage and wreck removal expenses. Now, so if we are to look at the Singapore regime of liability for recovery of these claims, I mean, you can have various claims, then how would you assert it against the ship owner? So as I mentioned, the CLC Convention and the Merchant Shipping Oil Pollution Act doesn't apply. So we would have to go under the Bunker Oil Pollution Act, right? And under the Bunker Oil Pollution Act, Section 3 provides for a strict liability of the owner for 3 heads of pollution damage. So firstly, there is damage caused in Singapore by the contamination. And here the damage, it basically is widely defined as any damage that is caused by the contamination, right? Secondly, the cost of reasonable measures that were taken to reduce such damage. So this would cover all your cleanup costs that have been incurred, right? And further, if the cleanup causes damage, then the cost of such damages, right, would also be recovered. So this is basically the type of claims that come under Section 3.1. I should also mention in passing that the Act also imposes a liability for recovery of the cost of reasonable preventive measures and damage caused by such measures. So it's not only the actual cleaning up costs, but if you incur costs to prevent the pollution from spreading further, for example, you can still recover those costs. And I mentioned it is strict liability in the sense that there are only very limited defenses that are available to the ship owner. There are 3 prescribed defenses. The first is if the discharge resulted from an act of war, civil war, or inevitable natural phenomenon. Secondly, if there's intentional damage caused by someone who is not an employee or agent of the owner, right? So if it's an external third party who causes the intentional damage which results in pollution, then there is a defense available to the ship owner. And the third is a very limited defense relating to government or other authority exercising its functions of maintaining lights or other navigational aids. Right, so that is for bunkers. Now for other pollutants, you have to go to the Prevention of Pollution by Sea Act, which, as I mentioned earlier, basically was enacted for the purpose of preventing pollution and imposing criminal sanctions, right? So the recovery of costs here under this act is limited to the cost of any measures reasonably taken by the appointed authority for removing or preventing the pollution, and such costs would be recoverable as a debt due to the appointed authority. And the appointed authority under the act is the MPA. And under the act here, the owner is strictly liable for the cost. There are no prescribed defenses under the act for the recovery of such costs. Okay. Now, I should also mention the limitation of the ship owner's liability. There is a limit under the BOPA, and that limit is basically calculated in accordance with the 1976 Convention on the Limitation of Liability of Maritime Claims as amended by the 1996 Protocol. Now, this convention is not a convention that is limited to oil pollution. It is a convention that applies generally to maritime claims, i.e. claims arising from the operation of a vessel. Okay, so it's a general limitation provision which applies to all such claims that fall within the convention. And the BOPA expressly provides that for a Section 3 liability, claims that fall under that liability would be covered by this convention. So in a situation, if you have a situation in Singapore similar to the Express Pearl, the claims that are brought here against the ship owner will be subject to this limit of liability. And I've done a very rough calculation based on the gross tonnage of the Express Pearl obtained from public sources. The limit is expressed in units of account or special drawing rights. The value fluctuates daily, and currently, based on the current exchange rates, it is around almost 37 million Singapore dollars. So that is the limit of liability under Singapore law. Of course, in different countries which have given effect to the Bunker Convention, there could be different limits that apply. And the other thing to note here regarding the limit of liability is that it is virtually unbreakable in the sense that the limit can only be breached under very limited circumstances where there has been either intentional or reckless conduct of the ship owner himself, right? So it is not sufficient to prove recklessness of the crew, because sometimes I think most maritime casualties, accidents occur because of some negligence, right? Otherwise you wouldn't have the accident occurring. And then recklessness is you would say, a higher form of culpability. It's more than negligence. But in the case of breaking limitation, the recklessness has to be that of the ship owner and not the crew, not agents or employees of the owner. So you need to show that the owner was reckless somehow in the operation or maintenance of the vessel itself, which can be very difficult in practice. And so this is a quid pro quo that you have in the Act, that you impose an almost strict liability in exchange for which the ship owner is entitled to limit its liability to a certain prescribed sum, right? And so when you have a situation like the Express Pearl, where you have many claimants who have suffered damage because of the pollution incident, the ship owner will start a limitation action and set up a limitation fund. And he will set up a limitation fund by paying the amount that has been calculated as his limit of liability into court. So when it does that, it will say, look, here's the limit of liability. All you claimants can go and claim against that, right? Prove your claims. Of course, the claims would be subject to proof in the usual course, meaning to say that the claimant would have to prove that this particular harm was caused by the pollution and that the damages is a proper quantification of the loss. If it is expenses incurred, then the expenses must be reasonably incurred, right? So that has to be proven. But the ship owner can sit back and say, I've set up a limitation fund. So that can be done for bunker oil pollution. Now, under the PPSA, there is no limit of liability prescribed. But as I mentioned earlier, under the PPSA, you can only recover the costs, or the appointed authority can recover the costs of measures, reasonable measures taken to prevent the pollution or to eliminate the pollution. Now, another important thing to note about the Bunker Convention and the BOPA is that in addition to giving rights of recovery against the ship owner, it also gives a direct right of recourse against the liability insurers of the ship. So basically, what the BOPA provides is that any ships that call into Singapore must have compulsory insurance to cover liabilities arising from bunker oil pollution. And ships that are registered in Singapore under Singapore flag, like the Express Pearl, for example, would have to carry such compulsory insurance in any case. And when you have that compulsory insurance, you have to produce a certificate of insurance, and the insurer will be liable directly for claims. But again, the insurer is entitled to the same defenses available to the ship owner, plus one additional defense, which is that if the ship insurer can prove that the damage was caused by willful misconduct of the ship owner, then he doesn't have to, he's not liable, right? And the insurer is also entitled to limit its liability in the same manner as the ship owner, but the limit cannot be broken in the case of the insurer. So in other words, if there was reckless conduct on behalf of the ship owner, then the ship owner is fully responsible, but the insurer cannot be responsible beyond the limit of liability. Now, I mentioned just now the HNS convention, and why did I mention it? That's because, as I said, there is a lacuna currently for chemical or losses caused by chemical pollution or pollution of other hazardous, noxious substances. And what the HNS convention has done is it has tried to plug this gap by providing for a similar compensation regime as the CLC and the Fund Convention. So in other words, there is a limitation, there is a liability regime plus a limit of liability and a HNS fund that would be established as a two-tier compensation regime. So the whole idea is to provide a comprehensive liability and compensation regime for damage caused by HNS cargo. Now, unfortunately, this convention has still not come into force because it will only enter into force 18 months after it has been ratified by 12 states. And at the moment, I believe that only so far around 5 states have ratified it. So I think we are still some way off from it coming into force, right? Okay, I just want to finish off by mentioning the SCMA, as I said earlier, and I must thank the SCMA for providing me with their slides. The reason why I've mentioned the SCMA and arbitration is just to say that perhaps for certain claims that arise from a maritime casualty or disaster, such claims may be more suited towards arbitration. Now, as you all probably know, that an arbitration can only apply if there is an arbitration agreement. And I would say that in the case of an oil pollution disaster, many of the claims for cleanup costs brought by government authorities or governments, claims brought by third parties such as fishermen or businesses that are affected by the pollution, these claims would normally go to the courts because there is no arbitration agreement. But claims that arise from contracts of carriage where there is already an arbitration clause may well be subject to arbitration. That's number one. Secondly, there is nothing to stop parties from entering into an ad hoc agreement to refer the particular dispute to arbitration if they consider it more suited for arbitration. Okay, so that's an entirely voluntary arrangement. Now, why would parties want to opt for arbitration? Very briefly, the main reasons that they do that, firstly, it's confidential, unlike court proceedings, which are public. Secondly, there is a flexible procedure. You can choose your rules of evidence, or you can, or in most cases, the strict rules of evidence that apply to court proceedings don't apply. And thirdly, you can choose your arbitrator, and this can be useful for certain technical disputes where the tribunal would have the relevant expertise. So arbitration can be useful in resolving certain disputes. Now, the SCMA, I think you would be familiar with various different types of arbitral institutions. ICC is I believe ICC has an office in Sri Lanka and presence in Sri Lanka as well. And then you have Hong Kong Arbitration Center, you have the SIAC, or Singapore International Arbitration Center, you have the Asian International Arbitration Center in Kuala Lumpur. And to add that to the mix, you now have the SCMA as well. Now, the SCMA was actually conceived specifically to cater for the maritime industry. In other words, it was set up by the industry players because they recognized that, or they wanted a more flexible and self-administered model for arbitration, and not to be bogged down by too many institutional rules. So it is something like the LMAA arbitration system, but with certain differences, right? And it basically is meant to provide a flexible and efficient way of conducting a maritime arbitration. And the advantage of going to SCMA is that because it is self-administered, it is not an institutional arbitration. A lot of arbitration institutions charge quite a high administrative fee for running the arbitration. And in the case of SCMA, because it is self-administered, it has got a lower scale of fees as compared to a lot of the other arbitration institutions. And the other advantage of using the SCMA is that it is located in Asia and is suitable for Asian parties. You don't have to travel to, London, for example. And it has a panel of very experienced arbitrators, including local arbitrators and arbitrators from the region. Its rules are very flexible and very, very user-friendly. So I think that's sufficient in terms of introducing the SCMA. And if you would like more details, you can always get in touch with me or to contact the SCMA directly for further information. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your valuable contribution, Mr. Bandari. I now invite my co-moderator, Mr. Nuzri Hussain, to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Chandaka Jayasundar, President's Counsel.
Thank you, Shanella. As pointed out by my co-moderator, Shanella Fonseca, our final speaker for today is President's Counsel, Mr. Chandaka Jayasundara. Mr. Jayasundara counts over 30 years of active practice in the Superior Courts of Sri Lanka, as well as the District Court, Commercial High Court, and the Admiralty Court of Sri Lanka. Mr. Jayasundara specializes in the field of commercial law with special emphasis on maritime law, multimodal transport law, international trade law, company law, IP law, and arbitration. He holds a master's in law in international trade from the University of Colombo. He's also the chairman of the committee appointed by the Minister of Justice to assess the environmental and economic damage caused by the Express Pearl incident. President's Counsel Chandaka Jayasundara will address us on the applicable laws and measures taken by the government of Sri Lanka against the persons responsible for the incident. Sir, I invite you to take the floor. So I don't think we can hear you, sir. You might have to change your mic. So I don't think we can hear you, sir. So I think your mic is muted, sir. No, sir, we can't hear you now. No, sir, we can't hear you. No, sir, I don't think we can hear you now. Unfortunately, sir, we can't hear you yet. Please bear with us, everyone, until we fix this technical glitch.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes, sir, we can hear you now. Thank you, sir.
Sorry, really sorry for the mix-up, and thank you, Nusri. It's a hard 3 acts to follow, but Dr. Gunawans has given me the added task of trying to address some of the concerns presented by the other speakers. That I will keep till the end, but I will deal with the local legislations in respect of a disaster of this kind and the compensation that can be claimed. Given the excellent basis that has been given with regard to the law by Dr. De Silva and Dr. Bandari, I think when we come to the Sri Lankan situation, it will be much clearer now in that context. Let me start sharing. Nusri, you can see it?
Sir, we can see your slides.
Okay.
Thank you.
Fine. Okay. So, as Dr. De Silva also touched on, and Mr. Bandari, Dr. Bandari also spoke about this, the fundamental legal regime that covers payment of compensation in respect of a marine disaster is dependent on the legal regime of each state. Now, there may be a situation where the coastal state which has suffered damage has ratified and entered into and given effect to international conventions. As addressed by the other speakers, the most important conventions are the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea and MARPOL in respect of marine disaster or marine disaster, and Sri Lanka, as Dr. De Silva said, has ratified both conventions and not in the strict way of introducing the provisions of the convention, like, for example, introducing the Hague-Visby rules under the in respect of Carriage of Goods Ordinance, Carriage of Goods Act, or the Vienna Convention under the Air Navigation Act, where the entire convention was brought into operation by the enabling acts. The Marine Pollution Prevention Authority, the Act, originally of 1981 and then amended in 2008, has taken the important provisions from the Law of the Sea Convention as well as MARPOL and some other the other conventions that Sri Lanka has signed, and brought it into a composite act, which you could say in effect is a codification of the different principles that have arisen in the or that have been given effect to in the international conventions. Now, even under the international conventions, it is important to note that the international conventions always says that it is an obligation for a state party to such conventions to have adequate domestic legislation in respect of the matters that have been covered in those conventions. And that in the event that there is domestic law established and legislated, then it would be not the convention provisions that would be apply, but the local domestic legislation that would apply in respect of claiming of compensation, among other things. Now, in the event, in a marine disaster situation, in the event that a state, that is the coastal state which has suffered damage, does not have local domestic legislation and does not have local legislation, but has signed into the or ratified the conventions, then the recourse that is available is to then provide the information and the damage that you have suffered to the flag state, which hopefully has adequate legislation, and for the flag state thereafter to proceed to claim compensation on behalf of the coastal state. That in itself is rather uncommon, because most of the coastal states in the world have ratified and brought into operation the provisions of the Law of the Sea and MARPOL. Those are the two main conventions that are important in respect of marine disaster. And Sri Lanka have ratified in respect of MARPOL. Out of the 6 annexes, as Dr. De Silva said, Sri Lanka has not ratified only Annex 6, which deals with air pollution by ships. So the important aspect that we need to look at, as Dr. De Silva also stated, that the principle that is applicable under the local legislation as well as the international conventions is that the polluter must pay for the cost of the damage that has been done by the polluter to the marine environment in this context. So the concept is that the polluter should bear the cost of measures to reduce pollution according to the extent of either the damage done to society or the exceeding of an acceptable level of or a standard of pollution. Now, this is the principle which underlies the provisions of the MPPA in Sri Lanka as well as the conventions, and this has been given recognition in Sri Lanka by the Supreme Court, mainly, and I think first in the Epavela judgment of Justice Amarasinghe, and thereafter, if I'm not mistaken, even in the in subsequent to Chunnakam judgment with regard to pollution by a power station in Jaffna, that the concept of polluter pays or the principle of polluter pays has been accepted as the criteria by the Sri Lanka Supreme Court of Sri Lanka. So the polluter, in terms of that principle, is responsible for the cost of the reduction of the pollution caused by his or her action, and the polluter must ensure that the environment is in an acceptable state after he acts or pays the cost. So the restoration process is also in terms of this international legal principle, as Dr. De Silva said, started from an economic, basic economic theory or economic principle, which has now become a legal theory. So the polluter then has the responsibility not only to pay for the damage that he has caused, but he must also pay for the restoration of the environment to the position that it was before the pollution occurs. This is common to both marine as well as land-based pollution. But even in the case of marine disasters or maritime disasters, the underlying principle is always that the polluter must, as I said earlier, must pay for the damage as well as the restoration of the environment back to an acceptable state. Having that in mind, the law of the sea, I will just deal with the two conventions which relate to the topic that I need to speak on. So the law of the sea provides in Article 235 that the state shall ensure that recourse is available in accordance with their legal system for prompt and adequate compensation or other relief in respect of damage caused by pollution of the marine environment by natural or juridical persons under their jurisdiction. So it's a responsibility and a convention obligation of the state of Sri Lanka to have local legislation to ensure recourse to recovery of compensation in respect of damage to the marine environment. Specifically, Article 220, sub-article 6 specifies that where there is a clear objective evidence that a vessel navigating in the exclusive economic zone and territorial sea committed a violation resulting in a discharge causing major damage or threat of major damage to the coastline or related interest or to any resources of its territorial sea or exclusive economic zone, that state may, provided that the evidence or warrants, institute proceedings, including the detention of the vessel in accordance with its law. So the law of the sea convention permits the state to establish and enact laws to obtain compensation, as well as providing provisions for the detention of the vessel and proceeding against the offending polluter. The next convention that is important to us is the MARPOL Convention. It's the Convention on the Prevention of Pollution from Ships with an additional protocol of 1972. Both have been ratified by Sri Lanka. It is only Annex 6 that has not been ratified by Sri Lanka. Now, this is the main international convention in respect of the marine environment or the pollution of the marine environment. And what is important here is there is a discussion that the laws in Sri Lanka is not adequate to cover a situation where the pollution is caused by hazardous, noxious substances, which is the subject matter of the HNS Convention. Now, the way Sri Lanka has proceeded in that regard, in terms of the MPPA, is that the definition of a noxious substance or a hazardous substance is in terms of, if I'm not mistaken, section 53 of the MPPA, it defines a noxious or a hazardous substance as a substance that is included in the list of hazardous and noxious substances that are stipulated under the MARPOL Convention. And the MARPOL Convention's list is also in consonance with, and I think if I'm not mistaken, it's identical to the list of dangerous goods that are specified in the IMGD code, which everybody who is involved in shipping has to adhere to. So the manner in which Sri Lanka has approached, I don't know whether it is purposely or by or whether the decision was taken not to go into details in respect of this, but is that the definitions that have been incorporated into the MPA is always in line with the international conventions that Sri Lanka has ratified. And also the definition that is given in the MPPA is wide enough to encompass a situation where no specific reference can be has been provided. So the MARPOL definition is that a harmful substance has been defined to mean any substance which, if introduced into the sea, is liable to create hazards to human health, to harm living resources and marine life, to damage amenities, or to interfere with other legitimate uses of the sea, and includes any substance subject to control by the convention. So any harmful substance that causes damage to the marine environment is considered as a harmful or hazardous substance. Now, HNC convention, of course, deals specifically with the with hazardous and noxious substances. Of course, the focus of that convention is much more limited. Also, as Dr. Bandari said, the MARPOL principle is more prevention rather than obtaining compensation in terms of the compensation for maritime damage. So it might not be strictly legalistically, it might not be quite correct in the manner that the MPPA is in operation, but for purposes of recovering damages, recovering compensation, I personally believe that the MPPA has enough provisions, as we can see as we go along. So, like the convention, the Law of the Sea Convention, the MARPOL law specifies that if there is any marine pollution, the convention, the country has to specify the law that is prevalent, and whenever such a violation occurs, that state shall either cause proceedings to be taken in accordance with its law, or furnish to the administration of the ship such information and evidence as may be in its possession that a violation has occurred. So if Sri Lanka does not have the capacity, wherewithal, or the legislative basis to proceed against the owner of the vessel, then all is not lost. You provide that information to the flag state for the flag state to take necessary steps and action against the owner of the vessel which is registered in the flag state. Now, as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, the Marine Pollution Prevention Act of 35 of 2008 is the operative enactment or legislation that covers maritime disasters. Now, there are aspects of the Law of the Sea, there are aspects of MARPOL, there are aspects of the CLC Civil Liability Convention within the Act. But the Act does not specifically bring all these conventions into operation. That is another way of legislative practice. I don't know whether it is 100% good or 100% bad, but I think what has been done is distilling what is essential in the conventions and bringing that into the Sri Lankan legislature, not as an incorporation of the convention principle, but as a standalone sui generis provisions in the convention, in the MPPA Act, right? So specifically with regard to compensation, Part 8 deals with criminal liability and Part 9 deals with civil liability, of which we will now discuss further. Now, before we go to that, what is important again in the context of us not being 100% sure what was carried on board this vessel, but definitely having knowledge that there has been a fair amount of chemicals and substance that has been carried on this vessel, such as nitric acid. It is important to see whether the pollution that the MPPA deals with and is trying to prevent, and which provides for compensation upon damage by such pollution, will include or is wide enough to include most of the newfangled chemicals and noxious substances that are being carried on board vessel. So what the MPPA defines pollution as any direct or indirect alteration of the physical, thermal, chemical, biological, or radioactive properties of any part of the marine environment by the discharge, emission, or the deposit of waste, including the introduction by man, directly or indirectly, of any substance or energy into the marine life. It's a long definition. So as to affect any beneficial use adversely or to cause a condition which is hazardous or potentially hazardous to public health, safety, or welfare of the animals, birds, wildlife, aquatic life, plants of every description, and hindrance to marine activity, including fishing and other legitimate uses of the sea. So, in the event a polluter directly or indirectly alters the physical, thermal properties of the marine environment by the discharge of any substance which will affect the marine environment and every other stakeholder in the marine environment, then that is defined as a pollution in terms of the MPPA. So it doesn't really matter whether the pollution occurs due to hazardous material, hazardous substances, noxious substances, bunker oil, or carrying cargo. The pollution as defined in the MPPA is that anything that alters the physical attributes or properties of the marine environment will be considered as pollution. Now, having that in our minds as a context, Section 26, which deals with criminal liability, stipulates that if any oil, harmful substance, or other pollutant. So we go back to what is a pollutant, is the definition given: any substance introduced by a polluter which will alter the environment or the physical characteristics of the marine environment. So pollutant is discharged or escapes into the territorial waters of Sri Lanka or any other maritime zone, so on and so forth. I will deal only with what is the subject matter of our discussion today. Then subject to the provisions of this Act, where the discharge or escape is from a ship, the owner, operator, master, or the agent of the ship shall be guilty of an offense under this Act. So what is required is the introduction or the discharge or escape of any oil or harmful substance or pollutant into the marine environment of Sri Lanka immediately gives rise to an offense in terms of Section 26, which is the principle of direct liability. So you don't have to show that the ship owner was negligent or he was reckless, intentionally reckless, to attribute liability to him. Here, the mere introduction of a pollutant is sufficient to attribute liability to the owner, the operator, master, or agent of the ship. Then that is the criminal liability. Section 34 specifies what the civil liability is. Civil liability is completely different to the criminal liability, and the fine that is applicable in terms of this criminal liability is around, if I'm not mistaken, rupees 12. It's limited to about rupees 12 million or 12 or 15 million. Civil liability, of course, the damage that can be claimed or compensation that can be claimed is without limitation, unless, of course, the damage has been caused by an oil pollution incident where the CLC convention comes into play, that is the civil liability convention comes into play. Then you, in terms of section 35, liability can be limited. I will come to that after we discuss section 34. So section 34 specifically says, where any act of pollution that is specified in 24 and 26, so that means the introduction of a pollutant into the marine environment of Sri Lanka results in the pollution of the territorial waters. Here, pollution means, the definition means, because of that, the introduction of a hazardous material, the marine environment, the physical properties of the marine environment has changed. Then the owner or the operator of the ship shall be liable for any damage caused by the discharge, escape, or dumping of any oil, harmful substance, so on and so forth, pollutant in the territorial waters to the coastal zone and the foreshore, right? So there, the state has the ability to seek compensation for any damage that is caused by that polluting incident. Second, so any damage will cover, I'll deal with that later. Then it also permits the state to seek compensation as to the costs of any measures taken for the purpose of preventing, reducing, or removing any damage caused by the discharge of the pollutant into the Sri Lankan waters. So here, like as I said when I commenced my presentation, the basic principle of polluter pays is incorporated in section 34, where the state, that is Sri Lanka, the government of Sri Lanka, is entitled to claim from the polluter the damage or the value of the damage caused by the polluter, as well as the cost of whatever steps that were taken by the state or any other party to limit the pollution. Okay, so when we call the section 36 further provides, 34 further provides that the foreshore, that is interest related to the territorial waters that is specified, the interest related to the interest related to the territorial waters includes marine, coastal, port, fisheries activities, tourism, health of the coastal population and their well-being, and the protection and conservation of living marine resources and wildlife. So this entire ambit of what is the marine environment, who are the stakeholders that are interested in the marine environment, including the people who carry out activities like fishermen for tourism and so on and so forth, and the population that is in the coastal area, and the marine resources in the territorial waters of Sri Lanka is covered, and any damage that is caused to such any of those interests as specified in the marine MPPA can be, so any damage can be claimed as compensation. So that is because we have been given only, I think, around 15 minutes on the topic. I think in a very truncated way, the collection of the presentations that have been made, I think will be sufficient for you to have an idea. And I would like to say that although some people do not agree with me on this, that the manner in which the MPPA has been enacted at the moment, we are more or less covered for any damage that can be caused to the marine environment to a greater extent. Now, I would now proceed, and I would like to deal with some of the questions that have been asked also with certain matters that have been raised by the speakers and the Sri Lankan context of, or to give a Sri Lankan perspective of that, which is a job given to me by Dr. Gunawansa. Now, first and foremost, Professor Pattiarachchi's position that the the damage to the environment might not be as much as was anticipated originally has some validity, but I think it would be rather obnoxious and unconscionable for the Sri Lankan state to claim damages or compensation for damages that has not occurred. I think, as Nusri said, because I am under certain constraints, because I am in this committee with regard to the legal aspects of the claim that is being made against the owners. But I would say that the intention has always been that if any damage has been caused, we have to be compensated. It is not that if there's no damage or some assumed damage is caused, we should be paid, or that the Sri Lankan state should be compensated. And it has always been, starting from the officials at MIPA and down the line, it has always been the basic premise is that if we can prove the damage, compensation has to be paid. How we prove it is a matter that has to be dealt with. But if there has been no damage, in actual fact, that is actually good, because that means the marine environment has not been damaged to the extent that we thought it would have happened. But if it is a question of compensation, the compensation has to be limited to the matter, the amounts that was the damage that had been caused. And then the next 2 or 3 points. Now, with regard to the conventions and the introduction or ratification and introduction of new conventions, I also from personal knowledge know that the government is considering ratifying most of the conventions. And in fact, there's a new MIPA amendment coming through. MIPA amendment coming through, or it is still in the process of being presented to Parliament. And one of the intentions is to bring into operation some of the conventions that are applicable. Now, as I noticed, Dr. D.L. Mendis has posed a question also. In ratifying international conventions, we must be careful that we don't bring in matters that might be not so suitable for the Sri Lankan context, because most of these conventions have been brought into operation, and as Dr. Bandari said specifically, there are aspects of limitation of liability. And as he correctly said, if there was oil pollution in respect of the Express Pearl, and the claim was in terms of the CLC, given the gross weight of the vessel MV Express Pearl, the amount that Sri Lanka could have claimed would have been limited to about $23 to 26 million. I think that is in line with what Ms. Bandari said, about 32 million Singapore dollars. It works to about $26 million. Now, how do we get out of that? That is provided for in Section 35 of the MPPA Act, that if there is oil pollution, automatic limitation comes with, and limitation is in respect of the value, with respect of the gross weight of the vessel. And to go above that, or to break the limit, you have to prove gross negligence, intentional reckless actions by the operator or the owner. Without that, without getting into negligence, you cannot go break the limitation that has been specified. So the job then becomes much more harder if there are certain conventions that are brought in where there are limitations. However, we are working in and we are trying to work in an international environment, trying to be a maritime hub. Then it is necessary also that our laws are in consonance with the international law. So irrespective of if the limitation is there, as long as you can work within the limitation, and there is provision, as already said, that there's a two-tier provision, because CLC, we are not a party to the fund convention. So therefore, after the limitation, we can't go to the fund to connect the fund convention to get anything more than the limitation. So when introducing new conventions or ratifying, it has to be we have to be very careful in the manner in which we introduce it. Sometimes it might be useful. Sometimes we may have to have some reservations, and of course we can still ratify, but have certain reservations with regard to certain provisions. Now, the next matter, okay. I think that would be, because I think I dealt with what Dr. De Silva said with regard to the other matters with regard to the, now, for example, the HNS convention is still not in operation. The introduction of the HNS convention was that chemical hazardous cargo that will be there is a compensation, direct compensation permitted for hazardous and noxious substances. But again, what is most important is there is a limitation liability clause in the HNS convention. So the government will have to be careful in introducing. It should not do so on a wholesale basis, but look at each convention and ratify them if necessary. I have been told very politely that I exceeded my limit, but I did 2 jobs today. But I hope what we have presented is of some value to you. And I think we are open for questions. Nasri?
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your speech. Now I would like to invite the panelists to join our panel for the questions and answers that have been posed by our listeners today. I would like to invite Professor Charita Pattiarachchi, Mr. Jainil Bandari, and President's Counsel Mr. Chandika Jayasundara to the panel to answer a few questions. We have received several questions from our guests today, but due to time restraints, we can only ask a few. So I'll invite Azim to ask the first question. Azim.
Thank you, Nasri. The first question is posed to Professor Charita Pattiarachchi. The question follows: whilst we are in a position to assess the visible damage, what steps should Sri Lanka take to mitigate any future damage and/or impact that could arise as a result?
I didn't actually, can you repeat it again, please?
Yes, sir, definitely. Yes, sir. Whilst we are in a position to assess the visible damage, what steps should Sri Lanka take to mitigate any future damage and/or impact that could arise as a result?
Okay, so it's 2 parts. This particular incident has happened, right? The things now 2 months down the track, the main thing that we have to do is to remove the wreck, or at least take all the containers and everything and make everything safe. That's the first thing that we have to do. The noodles, it's very difficult to be able to keep taking that, because every storm, every time it would come into the beaches, and it's a hard thing to actually mitigate, rather than just cleaning, but that can happen for years to come. What can we do? I mean, we have many meetings that we've had, workshops and things like that, and we make recommendations and nothing happens. Now, the material that I have showed you today is because all of them we're doing pro bono. It's just because we love doing what we're doing as scientists. But we should have a system in Sri Lanka that will, from my field, all this modeling should be available when the system happens. But unfortunately, we don't even have the data that is released between the different institutions. They hold on to it, so we can't get it. That's the first thing. So from an oceanography point of view, we do predictions 5 days, 6 days in advance, what's going to happen to the ocean. So it's not only mitigating incidents, it helps the fishermen, the safety of fishermen, search and rescue. There's a whole variety of things that benefit. So unfortunately, we are in a reactive society. So you ask the question, what can we do? And I can say what we will do, right? And I said this when the new diamond happened, why not have something in place? We would be far better prepared, but no, nothing happened, right? So now we are in the same situation, and I keep my fingers crossed that something may come up, but I don't have much hope. We write proposals, we write to many people, but they all disappear, unfortunately, till the next one happens.
Thank you for your hopeful answer, sir. I now pass it back to Nusri.
Thank you, Azina. I would call upon Shanna to ask the next question.
Thank you, Nusri. So my question is to Mr. Jainil Bandari. So the question is, how will Singapore legally deal with damage and or impact that may only come to light in the future?
Right. Are you talking of damage that is not apparent now, but arises subsequently when you say?
Right.
Yeah, because I think in these kinds of incidents, there is immediate apparent damage, which of course obviously would be your cleanup expenses, your immediate damage to the environment. And there could be damage that only surfaces later. For example, if a slick drifts somewhere else, and then other parties get affected, or it is found that there is contamination which has affected parties down the road. Now, the answer to that is that the claims can only be brought forward after they come into existence, right? So if damage arises later, but from the same incident, the claim can still be brought, provided it can be shown that the damage was caused by that pollution. And obviously, for in this kind of situations, you would expect the damage to be apparent, a few months at least after the incident, and not too long, because there's also a time bar that would apply, and that time bar would depend on the particular statute that applies. I hope I've answered the question.
Yes, Mr. Bandari, thank you for that answer. I now hand over control to Nusri Hussain once again.
Thank you, Shanla. The next question is to President's Counsel, Mr. Chandaka Jayasundara. Sir, this question is, in your opinion, is the Marine Environment Protection Act number 51 of 1981 sufficiently comprehensive to handle a situation of this nature? If not, what changes do you propose?
In my opinion, as of now, because it is either consciously or unconsciously so widely cast, we can bring in most of the situations that might arise in respect of a maritime disaster, we can. And the fact that the compensation level is also so widely cast, again, I don't know whether purposely or not, that for the moment it is sufficient, but it is sufficient for us. But if we go into the international field, Now I saw again Dr. Mendes, DL Mendes has commented that this is not the ideal. It is definitely not the ideal. One is there are so many conventions that Sri Lanka should ratify. I think we have not ratified maritime conventions for a very long time. Then with regard, when we sign those conventions, there are model laws that are recommended by UN agencies like the IMO, as Dr. Mendes has mentioned. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. This has been done, and as Dr. Bandari said, the Singapore uses a different method of, like the way we have brought in the carriage of goods, the Hague-Bisbee Convention, the Hague Convention, the Vienna Convention, by specific acts of Parliament. We can do it. It doesn't make it's not rocket science, and it has been done before. And also the other method of doing it is bring into operation and that has been done in the MPPA, that you give a lot of authority to the minister to bring in, and that is so in the Merchant Shipping Act also, where certain matters you can't go through the entire process of new legislation, then you give regulatory power to the minister to bring in convention ideas into the local law. That is available, and some of these provisions have been done in terms of that. So everything can be done. Now, I personally think now, for example, the 2006 Maritime Labour Convention, we were talking about bringing that into operation in 2007. I have done papers, and again, as Dr. Pattiarachchi says, we have done workshop after workshop on how that convention should be brought into operation in Sri Lanka from 2007. That's how many years? I don't know. I can't even count, right? But nothing. And one of the biggest complaints is that the convention, of course, is a huge technical convention. And if you're bringing it into Parliament, you have to have it translated to Sinhala and Tamil. And there are no sufficient people to translate the convention to Sinhala and Tamil. So recently I told the Director General, look, if you started in 2007, we could have translated it now. Because it's, I don't know, 18 years since then, right? So it's not that we can't do it. It's as usual, it's Sri Lanka, no, you don't, but it can be done. And I know personally, because I think Mrs. Lahandapura NEPA chairman is also watching. They are bringing in most of the conventions into operation, because we can't go on like this. And they are getting in, and they are updating the MPPA Act in line with those conventions, especially the Banca Convention, because those are important conventions. The wreck removal convention, the Nairobi Convention, those are important conventions that if we are a maritime, forget being a maritime hub, if we are a maritime state, if we are a coastal state and we want to protect our coast from these sort of disasters, we don't need to be a hub. For us to be a maritime state, we need all these things. So I think that push is happening because of the lessons that we are, if possibly, learned from this disaster. Hopefully, again, like Professor Pattiarachchi, fingers crossed.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Now I hand control to Vishara.
Thank you, Nusri. I would like to thank the moderators for posing the questions to our speakers. I now call upon Mr. Anuruddha Pereira, Senior Counsel and the Co-Chairman of the Overseas Relations Committee of the Bar Association of Sri Lanka, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Vihara. Can you all hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay, very good. Good evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this evening. And it's been a great pleasure to have you with us. And I seek your humble indulgence because this is the part I know everyone's impatient to go. It's taken a long time. But I would like to ask your indulgence, because this is the part where we also get to thank, very importantly, the people who work behind the scenes to make this event a great success. So first of all, it was a great pleasure to listen to and learn from the scholarly and informative presentations that have been delivered by 4 highly respected and renowned speakers, to name Professor Charitha Pattiarachchi, Dr. Lalanath De Silva, Mr. Jainil Bandari, Senior Counsel, and Mr. Chandaka Jayasundara, President's Counsel. Dear sirs, I wish to thank you profoundly and express my deep appreciation on behalf of the Bar Association of Sri Lanka and the Bar Council of Maldives for making time from your busy schedules to participate in this webinar and delivering your presentations, and for also assisting the International Relations Committee to advance our vision of knowledge sharing and international cooperation. We are very grateful indeed. I would also like to extend my thanks to Mr. Salia Piris, President's Counsel, President of the Bar Association of Sri Lanka, Mr. Maumun Hamid, Senior Counsel, President of the Bar Council of Maldives, Mr. Rajiv Amarasuriya, Secretary of the Bar Association of Sri Lanka, who's always available to us and works through many thick and difficult timelines to support us, and Ms. Zurek Wafir of the Bar Council of Maldives, who also was very helpful in bringing this collaborative webinar into fruition. I would like to thank my good friend, Mr. Pasintu De Silva, Attorney at Law, Assistant Secretary of the Bar Association, and Ms. Nelum Jayasinghe, Attorney at Law, for their committed assistance. I also want to profoundly thank my colleague and friend, Dr. Asanka Gunawansa, the Chairman of the Overseas Relations Committee of the Bar Association of Sri Lanka, Ms. Dushanti Adhikari, Attorney at Law, and Mr. Manjuka Fernandopulle, Attorney at Law, and the convener of the International Relations Committee of the Bar Association of Sri Lanka, for their assistance with this webinar. And a very special thanks to Ms. Vihara Herath, Attorney at Law, Mr. Azeen Abdullah, paralegal, who worked throughout this webinar and the planning of this webinar, and then Ms. Anne Devananda, Attorney at Law, and Mr. Nusri Hussain, Attorney at Law, and Ms. Chanel Fonseca, Attorney at Law, Ms. Shannon Tilakaratna, paralegal, and Mr. Janaka Kapuliyadda, who also worked tirelessly to bring this event to the success that it was. Normally, our webinars are attended by a much larger audience. This is a webinar that we had to put together in a rather rushed manner, but I'm still very appreciative that we had over 300 registrations. And at one point, we had well over 100 participants who were present at the webinar. So thank you all, and I wish you a very pleasant evening.
Thank you.
Back to Nusri and Vihara.
Thank you, sir, for so eloquently concluding today's proceedings. And with that, I would like to once again thank all of you for participating, and I hope to see you again at the follow-up webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.